session for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Avi. Avi did Red PPE with us at Somerville, and if I'm allowed to mention that. It's really lovely to be with you. And I hope to meet some of you in person at Somerville if you come to an open day, and even better than that, if you are invited to interview, and even better than that, if we admit you into the PPE degree at Somerville. It will be really lovely to meet you and to hear that this was our first encounter. So do let me know if that transpires. Yeah, my name's Patricia Owens, and I'm a professor of international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at Oxford, and a tutorial fellow at Somerville College. And I'm doing this politics virtual session to kind of give you, again, a sense of what it might be like if you studied politics as part of the PPE offerings that we have. The lecture I'm giving is on decolonization. So if you specialize in politics in your PP degree in your second year, and then you do the international relations core course, this is a course that you would then take after that. So it's quite an advanced course in the PPE degree, and it's on the more historical side. So this is a sort of international political history material that is, of course, of enormous relevance for thinking about contemporary international relations. So in my view, the whole course, international relations in the Cold War, era of the Cold War, could be called international relations in the era of decolonization, because very little of world politics during the 20th century was untouched by the struggles to overthrow imperial rule. So as you'll know, or hopefully you'll have a broad sense that during the 19th century, much of the world was territorially divided up among the leading European capitalist powers, most notably in what was referred to as the scramble for Africa in the 1870s. So by the beginning of the 20th century, more than 60% of the world's landmass was under the control of a handful of empires. These were primarily European powers: Britain, France, Holland, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, also the United States, and they were eventually joined in Asia by Japan. If somebody could switch off their microphone, that would be great. Thank you. So in 1913, the British Empire extended across more than 12 million square miles, some 24% of the world's landmass, taking in the dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, also the Indian subcontinent, and large stretches of Southeast Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. So the second largest empire was French, controlled about 5 million square miles, which was about 9% of the world's landmass, including Indochina, much of North, Central, and West Africa. The Japanese Empire incorporated Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, which was a part of China, and several islands in the Pacific. So in other words, non-European regions, right, with their own long-standing political, economic, and cultural traditions, were subjected to either direct or indirect subordination to European or Japanese power. However, by the late 1970s, most of these peoples had overturned formal imperial rule. So decolonization and the resulting worldwide interstate system that we live in today, the world of nation states, is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only about 60 years old, 70 years old. So what we're going to consider today then is this long, violent, uneven, and protracted process through which numerous colonies in Asia and Africa achieved formal political independence, right? That is, in which a system of colonial and imperial empires was transformed into a universal system of sovereign nation states. It didn't mean every nation had a state, but the world was territorially divided up into a state system. How did it come about? What were its causes and consequences? How was it shaped by the long confrontation between the US and the USSR, known as the Cold War? How did decolonization in turn shape and define the Cold War? And I've divided this lecture into two main parts. The first, I'm going to contextualize decolonization within a kind of wider history of world politics, notably the world wars and the Cold War. However, so decolonization is often dated to the post-World War II period. However, its origins really go back to World War I and its inter-imperial rivalries and the interwar period. And second, I'm going to trace different phases of decolonization and compare two important cases, one from Africa and one from the Middle East. And I'm going to end by addressing the inescapable question of neocolonialism and contemporary hierarchical relations between former empires and former colonized territories, when this sort of question of neocolonialism is often referred to as the kind of last and most enduring stage of imperialism. Okay, so turning to the first part then, when and why did the empires start to crumble? When did national liberation movements start to mobilize colonized peoples? And when and how was formal independence achieved? The first thing to note is the regionally and temporally uneven nature of the process, right? Even before most of Asia and Africa became subjected to European formal rule, most of the states in Latin and Central America had achieved formal independence by the 19th century. So if we leave Latin America aside, we can start to make sense of decolonization in terms of three historical contexts and preconditions. These are in the first half of the 20th century: World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. Of these, the first two events should more accurately be described as opening up the cracks of the old imperial order. In turn, the interwar crisis allowed anti-colonial elites to politicized colonized peoples. But it was only really the combination of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, that decolonization really gained an irresistible momentum, weakening Europe's primacy. Okay, so if we start with World War I, we have to return to the Treaty of Versailles, and two incredibly important developments. As you know, the Treaty of Versailles, the Versailles settlement was the agreement that ended the peace treaty that ended World War I. So first here was of significance for decolonization was the dismemberment of the empires of the defeated Axis powers, right? The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Second is the new global power of the US and the Soviet Union, right? The leaders of whom spoke about national self-determination for the European colonies. US President Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points, the set of principles he claimed should govern the Paris peace negotiations at Versailles to end World War II, included the idea of national self-determination, right? And in this case, why Wilson was particularly interested in national self-determination in this context was to ward off the increasing threat of socialist revolution around the world led by the new Soviet Union, a new communist state to threaten American hegemony and American capitalist systems. So self-determination for Wilson meant that national aspirations must be respected. These are his words, and that peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. So given the immense power of the United States and the Soviet Union's and the Soviet Union's support for anti-colonial movements, self-determination became a kind of new legitimating principle for international politics. So this new discourse helped to replace older notions of empire as the kind of right of the strong with a different vision of international hierarchy of unequal membership in the League of Nations. So the vision, Wilson's vision, was not a kind of world of equal sovereign states self-determining. It was still a hierarchical order, but it was not the same one as the European powers had established. Wilson, like his French and British counterparts, did not support national self-determination for British or French colonies in Africa and Asia. But as self-determination, this language and talk of self-determination fueled a series of popular protest movements across the Middle East and Asia, heralding the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism as a major force in world affairs. The other important point to make here is the emergence of institutionalized collective efforts at the newly created League of Nations to manage up the breakup of the Axis empires that I mentioned earlier. Right, former Ottoman territories and German colonies were transferred to Britain and France, but they were not transferred as colonies as such, but as mandates. So a mandate is a term in international law specifying a sort of interim legal status for certain territories transferred from the control of one colonial power to another. And the idea here was that these regions were going to be only ruled for a sort of transitional period while preparing them for self-government. Now, for Britain and France, this was supposed to be a very, 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 very long transitional period. That there was not a unified sense in which self-determination and decolonization were inevitable at this point. But the point is that the idea of trusteeship set a precedent. It implied that all colonial possessions, including those of Britain and France, were regarded as in some sort of transition towards self-determination. In the case of the post-Ottoman Middle East, this led to an explosive situation in Europe known as the quote-unquote Eastern Question, right? So there was a secret French-British agreement in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Some of you may have heard of this, in which that Britain and France agreed to that Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan would be incorporated into the British Empire. So these were formerly Ottoman territories, now British, and that Syria and Lebanon would join the French Empire. Yet during World War I, Arab nationalists and insurgent fighters were a major force in defeating the Turkish and Ottoman forces that ultimately led to the end of the Ottoman Empire and its rule over vast swathes of the Middle East. And so after World War I, sort of anti-Ottoman Arab nationalists transformed into anti-British and anti-French pan-Arab nationalisms, right? This is the powerful idea that the Arab world, the Middle East, wouldn't be somehow transferred over, parts of it portioned up and transferred over to Britain and France, but that the whole of the Middle East should be united as an independent unit based on Arab Islamic civilization, this idea of pan-Arabism. So if the mandate system assumed some sort of transition towards self-determination, were the European empires willing to allow the emergence of a kind of pan-empire, a pan-great power in the Middle East? And of course, the answer was no. And so the sort of carving up and division of different territories was part of resisting the force of pan-Arabism. The Soviet Union also came to challenge the idea of empire in the interwar period, right? Effectively agreeing with Wilson's notion of self-determination, but it was there but Vladimir Lenin, the socialist communist idea of self-determination, was much more radical. For Lenin, self-determination was not conceived as a kind of mechanism for replacing empires with states into which the United States could export its goods and influence, the geopolitics of the region. So this was in part Wilson's motivation. For Lenin and the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union, I should say at this point, it was part and parcel of a global socialist strategy. So the Soviet idea was to support national liberation movements with a double objective: one, to weaken the bourgeoisie in the old European empires, and two, to prepare the terrain for socialist revolution in the ex-colonies, right? The step that there would be global socialist revolution, that if colonized peoples could determine their own fate, they would obviously choose socialism and the redistribution of wealth instead of capitalism and the continued capture and domination of wealth by the capitalist elites. So for the Soviets and for many anti-colonial activists themselves, national self-determination meant not just anti-imperialism, it meant progressive social political transformation towards communism or some version of socialism. So the temporary convergence of Wilsonianism and Leninism had long-term consequences for the old European empires. At the very moment when Britain and France dominated the world map by incorporating not only their own territories, but also those of the defeated empires in World War I. The high tide of empire had already passed. In large part, this was because the United States and the Soviet Union became champions for anti-colonialism, though in quite different ways. Or rather, they championed anti-colonialism where independence struggles didn't interfere directly with their own national interests. But the push for decolonization, of course, primarily also came from not just from outside, but from inside. The roots of decolonization were fundamentally local. During World War I, Britain and France had drawn extensively on the resources of their colonies, including raw materials and soldiers. But in turn, the colonies now claimed compensation and recognition and self-determination. And I'll come back to those expectations later. The general point I want to make is that we see a much stronger anti-colonial resistance in this context. Because with anti-colonial movements having greater success in organizing colonized populations. The second event that radicalized anti-imperial commitments was the Great Depression from 1929. So if the Versailles Treaty had undermined the political case for empire, the Great Crash undermined the economic one. Until 1929, imperialism had brought at least some prosperity to parts of the colonized populations, the elites who collaborated with the oppressors. So part of the local but Western-oriented bourgeoisie, most notably merchant elites and the political establishment, enjoyed relative prosperity under colonial rule. The main economic connection with empire revolved around the primary export center, such as agriculture. And this also helped to keep parts of the local population in work. But the viability of this sector was undermined with the downturn in world prices and the subsequent rise in tariffs and quotas in the metropole. So worldwide economic discontent translated into calls for political independence in colonies. Economic dependency became unacceptable even to those who had previously benefited from it, namely the bourgeoisie in the colonies. Most crucially, for the first time, emerged a common interest between the colonized peasants and the indigenous educated elite in colonial societies. So after the Great Crash, the convergence of their class interests created a mass political base for national independence. So by 1929, we can start to speak of a sort of general political and economic crisis of imperialism. The third and decisive historical precondition to decolonization was World War II. First, it's important to note that until 1943, so fairly far into World War II, the biggest empires, Britain and France, were on the losing side of the war. The Germans had easily defeated France on the European continent, and they had bombed Britain. Japan was becoming hegemonic in the Pacific. The Japanese had defeated the British, French, and Dutch militaries in Southeast Asia, and especially the British loss of Singapore in 1942, massively undermined the case for European rule in Asia. It also undermined the myth of white supremacy, right? The fact that the British and Dutch had lost to an Asian empire destroyed the aura of European power. So in the eyes of many colonized populations, the old empires were no longer able to guarantee the security of the colonies, or indeed their own security in Europe. Second, although France and Britain eventually emerged on the victorious side in World War II, this victory was conditional. It was premised on the combined power of the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as anti-Japanese nationalist resistance in Asia. So the shift in the global balance of power during World War II was away from the old empires, who were now outflanked by the new global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So it was now impossible for the old empires to really restore the authority and their authority and credibility in the colonies. Third, this imperial, what we might think of as a legitimation crisis, found expression in the Atlantic Charter, which was signed by US President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill in 1941. And it set out US and British goals for the world after the end of the war. So it reconfirmed a commitment, in principle at least, to self-determination as a national right, even though it wasn't meant to apply to British colonies, and Churchill had no intention of giving up the empire in 1945. But again, this principle of self-determination was later soon codified in the UN Charter, which was the founding document of the United Nations, which was signed in San Francisco in June 1945. And the Charter of the United Nations, which was the international organization that superseded the failed League of Nations experiment, it updated the Versailles mandate system, which the League of Nations had overseen, establishing so-called trust territories. So the move away from mandates to trust territories to facilitate what was imagined to be the non-violent transition of power, which would be supervised by the UN Trusteeship Council. So in this period, we see also increased coordination of anti-colonial struggles across the world. So anti-colonial guerrilla movements acquired better military equipment during the war. They began to develop national political programs and greater international solidarity, all helping the anti-colonial cause. We saw this all over the world, but also, for example, in Vietnam, in China. Okay, so by 1945, decolonization was high on the international agenda, and at least on paper, was accepted by most Western governments, but it was violently resisted by many, including Britain and France. Now, if we turn to the second part of the lecture, we can distinguish between three broad phases of decolonization. First, in 1945 to 1956. During this period, decolonization mainly affected Africa, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. So it mainly affected Asia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. The second phase lasted from roughly 1956 to 1975. In Africa, this mainly affected Ghana, Congo, and Algeria. In Asia, the Middle East, in Asia and the Middle East, this happened in Malaya, Kuwait, Oman, and Yemen. It affected Cyprus and Malta in the Mediterranean, and Jamaica in the West Indies and elsewhere. what was referred to as the West Indies at the time, now the Caribbean. And the third phase was very late, between 1974 and 1975, affecting mainly Portuguese Africa, especially Angola and Mozambique. So the rest of the lecture will focus on the first wave of decolonization from the late 1940s to 1950s, since in many respects this is the most important. And we'll find here that there was no general temporal or causal pattern to the decolonization process. And I'm going to use the two cases of Ghana and Egypt to illustrate the diversity of the decolonization process. So in the first example, I'm going to focus on the independence struggle in the Gold Coast, which later became Ghana. So Africa remained important to the old empires during and after World War II. Britain had lost access to important raw materials after a series of military defeats to Japan in Southeast Asia during the war. Hence, Britain pushed for more rapid expansion of the production of primary resources in Africa, especially rubber and tin. In 1945, the newly elected Labour government, passed the Colonial Development and Welfare Act, which provided £122 million for limited colonial reforms. So the driving force behind these narrow social and constitutional reforms was a new and powerful lobby in African politics, demobilized soldiers who had served during World War II. So on returning home, these veterans who had fought, on the side of the Allies in the war, they were politicized. They articulated their demands for greater political freedom and labor rights. In response, the British brought in some reforms to the legislative councils of Nigeria and the Gold Coast, and so they expanded the powers of the legislative councils that would advise the colonial administration, and they allowed Africans a majority of seats on these councils. But so this is a sort of reformist agenda meant to stabilize the colony rather than overturn colonialism. But it soon became clear that sort of any push for economic development largely bypassed the local population. So there was high inflation, much greater discontent about the monopoly of British companies over exports, high levels of unemployment, especially among ex-soldiers. So by early 1948, riots were breaking out in Accra on the Gold Coast. Britain's response, the colonial response, initially was first to clamp down on political organizers, to make arrests. They arrested Kwame Nkrumah, who was the socialist leader of a new political party, a new nationalist party, the United Gold Coast Convention. So this repression radicalized the movement, contributing to its victory in the first legislative elections, including a seat for Nkrumah, who was still in jail. So at this point, in this moment, Britain faced a choice. It could give in to the demands of self-government, or it could risk a prolonged and expensive period of political instability. So eventually, by 1957, Britain accepted Ghana's independence. So this established Ghana as the first major sub-Saharan state to gain formal independence. But that was not the end of the story. Nkrumah was part of a much wider Pan-African movement. Like the Pan-Arab movement that I mentioned earlier, Pan-Arabism was a strategy for liberation based on the idea that all African peoples shared common social and cultural ties. And there's a sort of long and diverse history of Pan-African thought and activism, which takes different forms in different locations and historical moments. But the common idea of Pan-Africanism is a rejection of the artificial boundaries established by European imperial powers in favor of a continent-wide federal government to determine Africa's political and economic future. So to achieve this goal, Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first prime minister and president of independent Ghana, organized a series of conferences to push for African unification. These efforts were really thwarted by the growing impact of the Cold War on African national liberation struggles, and also sort of different views, among African leaders about the benefits of African unity. So the final defeat for Pan-Africanism came at a conference in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 1963. Under massive influence from the United States, 32 African states agreed that rather than move towards a continental federation, they should create and become members of the Organization for African Unity, which still exists. Thereafter, during the period of the Cold War, African states largely split into two groups, those aligned and backed by the West and those aligned with the Soviet Union. Both superpowers tended to install and support authoritarian regimes that brutally suppressed their populations and allowed the continued extraction of wealth from the north to the south. And as historian Vanessa Ogle has recently shown, we can also think of decolonization in this context as a financial event and a movement of money. So with the onset of decolonization, many white settlers, officials and businessmen in the colonies sought to move their money quickly out of newly independent states. Right? They didn't want to repatriate their money back, quote unquote, home to the metropole, where they would face higher taxes to fund the post-war expansion of the welfare state in Europe, which was happening at this time. So we find that there's actually a direct connection between decolonization, money panics about what to do with wealth extracted in the colonial context, and the huge proliferation of tax havens located in former territories of the British Empire, right? The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So there's a close link between decolonization and the expansion of tax havens in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. Okay. So if we turn to the Middle East, the situation was equally complex. Here, from the very start, Western interests clashed with anti-colonial demands, especially under the impact of the growing US-Soviet antagonism. Right, this was due to three key factors. First was the region's richness in oil, a strategic commodity of the utmost importance for Western industry. Second was the geostrategic and geocommercial importance of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf. And third, of course, is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Decolonization in the Middle East cannot be explained by a single pattern, but one common factor was the British and French desire to establish client regimes. These so-called protectorates ruled over local peoples and territories while elites profited from lucrative oil deals with Western companies. So in the 1950s, most of these regimes were swept aside by a series of popular movements, revolutionary coups and insurrections. So, for example, in Iran, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a moderate socialist, came to power in 1951. One of his first acts was to nationalize Western oil companies, meaning that the profits from Iran's oil would stay in Iran. This policy was reversed by a military coup orchestrated by the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which put the Shah's family back on the throne until the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser led the revolution in 1952. Similar revolutions occurred in Iraq in 1958 and Syria in 1963. Rather than accepting these political events as part of the self-determination of formerly Ottoman and then formerly European territories, Britain and France tried to engineer counter-coups, sometimes overt, sometimes covert. So the most notorious of these was in 1956, which in Britain is called the Suez Crisis, and in Egypt is called the tripartite aggression. I'll say more about this case because it exemplifies how decolonization became entwined with the decline of European powers and the rise of superpower rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. So Egypt had unilaterally declared independence in 1922, though Britain continued to control the Suez Canal. So in 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty recognized Egypt's full independence, but also Egypt in that treaty consented to British military forces in the Suez Canal Zone. So this canal zone is an incredibly important artificial waterway created by French business interests in 1868, connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And crucially, this canal zone is indispensable as the main British route to India, right, allowing ships to sail between Europe and Asia without having to navigate all the way down around the coast of Africa, if you can imagine. Upon Egyptian independence, British and French shareholders retained ownership of the Suez Canal Company, right, the corporation that operated the waterway. However, in 1952, a military coup led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the corrupt and British subsidized Egyptian monarchy. Right, Nasser, who was a leading pan-Arabist, negotiated the withdrawal of British troops by 1956, promising in return free navigation of the Suez Canal. So Britain was forced to accept this deal since the US quietly supported Egypt's demands for fear of driving Egypt into the Soviet camp. In fact, so Colonel Nasser was highly aware of the political leverage that he possessed by playing the great powers off against each other. This ran into trouble with when Nasser was openly supporting Algerian independence, especially during the anti-colonial insurrection against French rule in Algeria in 1954. At the same time, so this annoyed the French. At the same time, as a pan-Arabist, Nasser was also a vocal proponent of the Palestinian cause, blocking the free passage of merchant ships to Israel through both the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran in the Red Sea, in objecting to Israel's occupation of Palestine. At this point, the US changed its pro-Egyptian policy, withdrawing loans to Egypt for the construction of the Aswan Dam. In response to this, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company and started to collect tolls for the passage of ships. So in response to this sort of show of national independence in Egypt, London and Paris hatched a secret plot with Israel to mount a joint military operation to regain control of the Suez Canal and overthrow Nasser. So they made these plans without informing the United States or seeking its approval. So as the military operation unfolded, with Israel advancing deep into the Sinai Peninsula, US President Dwight Eisenhower strongly opposed the intervention. He calculated that it was in the United States' national interest to be seen as the champion of anti-colonialism, like to prevent a slide of decolonizing states towards socialist policies and into the Soviet camp. So the United States introduced a resolution at the UN Security Council demanding the immediate withdrawal of French, British, and Israeli troops. Even worse for the British, the United States started selling pound sterling on the international currency markets, driving down the value of the pound and causing a currency crisis in Britain. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used this, threatened to drop atomic bombs on Britain for its aggression in Egypt, and used the crisis as a pretext for its 1956 invasion of Hungary to put down an attempted democratic revolution there, killing over 2,500 people. So this Soviet response was a calculated act of geopolitical brinkmanship by the Soviet Union. If the West could undertake military intervention in its sphere of influence, then the Soviet Union would do so in theirs. The whole episode ended when the French and British withdrew in utter humiliation. The British Tory Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in shame. Thereafter, UN troops policed the Suez Canal. At the same time, given the distraction caused by Suez, the Soviets got away with their 1956 suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. So the Suez crisis has regularly seen as the sort of, really the death knell of the British Empire. And it was really only then a matter of time that it ended and declined, and that Britain would sort of recognize that it could not really do anything now independent of the United States, or do anything that was actively opposed by the United States. It was sort of humiliated by the superpower that was supposed to be its friend. So thereafter, really, it was managed decline for Britain. It became very clear after Suez that decolonization could not be stopped or reversed by military means, but it didn't stop the empires from trying. Two of the most violent ends to the British Empire were in Malaya and Kenya in the late 1950s, when British armed forces were directly involved with forced displacements and massacres of civilian populations in order to prevent decolonization in Malaya, or independence in Malaya. An anti-colonial communist insurgency was defeated by forcibly removing 1 million people into concentration camps. In Kenya, anti-colonial resistance was brutally suppressed using similar methods, including torture and the deaths of over 20,000 Kenyans. Okay. So by the early 1960s, the key question for the decolonizing world was no longer primarily whether independence would happen. For most, the question was what kind of regime would be installed after independence. Would it be pro-Western capitalist or pro-socialist and allied with the USSR? For others, for many, this was a terrible choice, right? Attempts were made to pursue non-alignment with either superpower. In this respect, the Cold War had a very paradoxical effect on decolonization. On the one hand, it hastened formal decolonization, since the United States and Soviet Union both viewed their material and ideological interests to be served by anti-imperialism. On the other hand, the Cold War and superpower intervention interfered with attempts at post-colonial state building, non-dependent economic development, and meaningful democratization. So each superpower tried to draw the new nations into their spheres of influence. in some ways kind of corrupting what we might think of as real self-determination. This tragedy was sharply analysed, most sharply analysed perhaps by Kwame Nkrumah, who I mentioned earlier, the first president of newly independent Ghana. There's also a writer and an intellectual. I recommend his pamphlet, Neocolonialism, The Last Stages of Capitalism, a play on Lenin's claim that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism. So Nkrumah characterized post-colonial state building as the post-colonial state as neo-colonial, right? Because political independence, formal sovereignty recognized by the international community, recognized by a seat in the UN's General Assembly, was in practice really just a formal, legal, juridical kind of sovereignty. But it was not real sovereignty if outside powers continued to massively interfere in the political affairs of newly independent states, right? Or if post-colonial states remained economically dependent on outside assistance, if there continued to be a net transfer of wealth and resources from Africa to the global north, right? Entrenching inequality between states and within post-colonial states. So in these and in other ways, neocolonialism was, at least for Nkrumah, the last stage of imperialism. However, since the 1950s, growing awareness of neocolonialism has also led to a series of attempts by post-colonial states to self-organize and resist. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the so-called non-aligned movement, which rejected alignment with either the United States or the Soviet Union. It was formalized at a meeting in the Javanese city of Bandung in 1955. So there's a historic meeting of Afro-Asian states led by India, Egypt, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia, and they formed the non-aligned bloc of newly independent states. And the express purpose was to refuse to take sides in the Cold War, to denounce colonialism, to disengage from the East-West conflict, and to pursue independent paths of economic development. So throughout the 1960s and 1970s, what was then referred to as the third world states sought to achieve not the first world of the West, not the second world of the Soviet bloc, but the third world, sought to achieve more control over the ways in which aid, trade, and foreign investment affected their economies. And these states called for what was at the time called a new international economic order, the NIEO. So this new international NIEO movement worked through the UN system. It worked through groupings such as the G77 and the non-aligned group, asserting states' rights to sovereignty over their natural resources and calling for more equitable trade regimes. This was really a call for weaker states' rights to control key industries and the multinational corporations extracting wealth and resources. They were largely unsuccessful in this endeavor. The United States and its allies, the former colonial powers, blocked significant reform of the global economy, perpetuating what Nkrumah was referring to as neocolonial relations. So let me wrap up now then by emphasizing that most post-colonial societies remain plagued by several problems directly related to the process, to empire itself and the processes of decolonization. First is political instability, right? Many post-colonial states were like hostages in the Cold War, providing the theater for many proxy wars between the US and the Soviets that killed millions. We can think about the war in Vietnam, for example, or the war in Afghanistan. Superpower interventions into the decolonizing process, especially from the United States, led to regular coups, counter coups, and the installation of military juntas and one-party dictatorships. So the establishment of democracy or meaningful self-rule in many cases was very, very difficult, if not impossible. Second was interethnic and interdenominational violence, right? The borders of most colonies were drawn by the imperial powers, largely based on their own strategic and economic calculations. So many states were artificial territorial constructs, combining multi-ethnic and multi-religious provinces with little in common except for their rulers. The point is not that multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities are necessarily in violent struggle with each other. But the fact is that imperial powers played on and manipulated these differences during imperial rule, and that contributed massively to conflicts that continue to destabilize many post-colonial societies today. Here we might think about India and Pakistan. So third, economic development. During the 1960s and the 1970s, economic growth in many post-colonial states was quite remarkable. This was because of a combination of general worldwide growth during the long economic boom from 1945 to 1973, and the willingness of both superpowers to subsidize their newly independent allies. However, the general economic crisis of the 1970s brutally halted many local development projects. And at the end of the Cold War, the flow of funds from the United States and the Soviet Union halted. So for some time, economic inequalities between global North and South have increased. And this is perhaps one of the most troubling legacies of how decolonization occurred. I'll wrap up there. Thanks for listening. I'd be delighted to take any questions or comments now until 5 o'clock. If you have any, if you like, I'm not sure how we're going to take the questions, whether they'll be in the chat.
I think
And
that'll probably
Avi will read them to me. Should we do it that way?
I think that'll probably be best. I don't know if
Okay.
you can see the chat.
Yeah, I'm in the chat
Yeah.
now.
Perfect. So if you've got any questions, Patricia, I think we do have Celine, who is our student, who does, I think she does PPE, at Somerville. And if you are here, Celine, please do unmute and introduce yourself. But otherwise, if you've got any questions about studying politics at Oxford, the PPE course, I think Patricia will be able to talk about the politics element of that. And then if you've got any questions about being a student doing politics at Oxford, I can actually answer those as well as Celine, because as Patricia said at the beginning, I was a student here last year and I just finished my degree, which was in PPE. And I took, you might know this already, but you can take 2 subjects of the 3 into your final years, which are the second and third year. And I did
Or you can
politics
take
and
3.
philosophy. Oh,
You
you
can
can take
take all
3.
3.
Yes.
You can do all
Sorry.
3. Yeah. But you can also drop one of them if you want
Yes.
to. Sorry,
That's all right.
Avi.
No, very
Can
important.
I suggest that the first round of questions come about decolonization, if anybody has that. I mean, I'm very happy to answer questions about the substance of what I've just talked about, as well as questions to do with politics, studying PP or politics at Oxford and the admissions process. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, we don't usually have no questions, but perhaps they're all typing. There we go. Oh,
Okay. So the question is, in your opinion, it's from Giuseppe, I think. And it says, the question is, in your opinion, do you think that these countries were truly liberated, freed, given that they went on to be plagued by so many problems? I mean, I think that that's what the lecturer is suggesting. And I think if you're asking whether that's my opinion, I mean, I think that is that is my opinion. I think that there were, as I've sort of said in the lecture, enormous implications of the way decolonization happened for the independence and the self-determination and the economic and political choices that newly independent societies were able to make. And I think that that's not. I don't think that that's very controversial to say that, and that is also my opinion. I think I think most historians would agree with that as an observation. Okay. So there's a question about submitting written work, but I'm going to go to the question. I'm going to come back to that one. Maybe Avi, if you could make sure that we come back to Amelie's question.
that's fine.
No,
Yeah.
to Cosette's question, and then I'm going to try and take the questions that relate to the empirical, to the lecture. As the Cold War influence was paradoxical to the rate of progression of decolonization, do you think that decolonization would have taken longer if the Cold War had no effect? Oh, a counterfactual question. That's a great question. I'm not very good at counterfactuals. I mean, I think I think we can't know the answer to that question. I think I don't think it would have taken longer. Well, yes. I mean, I think that logic of what I've set out in the lecture is that it did hasten decolonization. but it impacted, it hastened the sort of historical event of decolonization. It brought it forward, but it negatively affected the quality of decolonization, if you will, right? So had had independent states managed to be free themselves from the empires and not be so profoundly influenced by either the Soviet Union or the United States, or caught up in their antagonism, which became a global antagonism, then there would have much more likely have been meaningful self-determination. I mean, if we think about the example of Vietnam, for example, so Vietnam was a French colony, and in World War II, Japanese forces defeated French forces in Asia, and Vietnamese nationalists were fighting against Japanese forces in Asia to become a free independent state at the end of World War II. With the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, Japan withdrew all of its forces from Asia, and the most powerful military and social and political movement in Vietnam at that point was the communist movement. They had been the most effective at defeating and fighting against Japanese and French forces. And left to its own devices, I suppose Vietnam would have become a socialist republic, a socialist state. The US didn't want to see another state in Asia become socialist. China had become a socialist republic at the end of its civil war, and sought to support the French return into Vietnam. It propped up the French, attempt to reclaim its Vietnamese territories. France failed to do that. The United States took over and fought a long, protracted war in order to prevent the communist takeover of Vietnam. I think that's an example of the dynamic that I've been describing. Would you say that Eastern Europe went through a system of decolonization and neocolonialism in the same way that African nations did? I mean, not in the same way. So, I mean, so many many countries in Eastern Europe were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were more likely to be recognized as, so when Wilson was talking about self-determination, he was primarily talking about the Eastern European countries, the European countries, and the issue there was primarily one about minority rights, like what in territories where there were large numbers of Germans, but it was in Poland, for example, or lots of mixed multi-ethnic states. How would minorities be protected? The question wasn't should these countries be recognized as independent states, and this was a British foreign policy objective as well, was also to see multiple states in Eastern Europe to prevent a kind of larger German empire in the center of Europe. And the Soviet Union, of course, as you know, if anyone know anything about your Cold War history, the Soviet Union essentially set up puppet regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of World War II as a kind of bloc to expand its social system, but also as a sort of geopolitical bloc against the threat to it from the West. And there are various attempts to sort of resist this throughout the second half of the 20th century, and it was only with the collapse of the Soviet Union that we saw better, more self-determination in Eastern Europe. It's a very sort of different. There are similarities but differences. I think that's the sort of general observation about making these comparisons. Do you think anything can be done to help these post-colonial states, or given the interest of former imperial powers often not aligning with those states, is this not possible? Anything to help these post-colonial states? I think we could look at debt forgiveness and debt relief. I think we could look at the forms of fairer and fairer trade. I think we can look at development aid and assistance. I think there's lots and lots of different things that can be done to improve the sort of economic and political self-determination of formerly colonized states around the world. That's a bit of a general answer to a general question. It's a little bit out of topic as well because it's a bit contemporary and it's not that's not entirely my field. But I mean I think that's certainly the case. I mean, it's we can perhaps not go too far into the fact that the Trump administration has ended support for the USAID, which was providing some economic assistance in different contexts. Regarding decolonization, what type of institution establishments managed to serve the ordinary people of the post-colonial countries after some sort of basis for self-determination was formed? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Institution establishments managed to serve the ordinary people. I mean, this in many post-colonial countries had very, often similar kind of government structures to the imperial state. So government bureaucracies, ministries of health, ministries of education, economic ministries, government forms of government bureaucracy that are ostensibly there to support ordinary people. Whether they were successful or not, is really the question. Trade unions, universities, all kinds of institutions were existed and were established to do that. How much do you think the concept of settler colonialism complicates narratives of decolonization, like in Palestine or Australia? I mean, it does. So there are different forms of imperial rule and colonialism. Generally, we differentiate between empire as a kind of political structure that has a sort of center and core and expands out and incorporates, different territories into its domain. We talk about colonialism as the process of incorporating territories into a wider empire, and settler colonialism being one where there's a sort of, people from one territory go and live in another and make their lives there, and in some sense govern that territory. And that's the process of settler colonialism. And imperialism is a term actually that didn't actually come into wide use until the 1870s and the period of towards the scramble for Africa, that it represented something quite distinct, which was a form of overseas rule that didn't involve settling and directly governing, but indirectly governing. So the scramble for Africa, although there was some settler colonialism in Kenya, for example, it was a sort of the imperialism, the empire of maps and flags. So, there was a sort of sense in which this territory was now British territory and was recognized by other European states as British territory or French territory. But it didn't always involve, again, sort of settler populations. And then there are cases where, decolonization hasn't happened in settler colonial context. So take the example of Australia that is given, where there are native populations, Aboriginal populations who are living under, they say, continue to live under settler colonial occupation that they don't recognize. They haven't ceded the land that is now lived on by the settlers. And this is a different there are lots and lots of cases where decolonization did not happen for many, many populations. I sort of mentioned it very, very briefly in the lecture, but lots and lots of peoples, the Kurds, for example, the Palestinians, for example, who don't have an independent state that might otherwise have one in the context of decolonization. How did the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union accelerate or complicate decolonization efforts in Africa and Asia? Were there specific cases where superpower involvement directly changed the outcome or speed of independence? I think I've given a a good example of that earlier when I spoke about Vietnam. And which parts of decolonization history do you feel are overlooked in mainstream media and narratives, perhaps cultural or intellectual decolonization, or the part played by women in independence movements? Absolutely, there's still, more historical work that should be done on, various aspects of decolonization. I'm not sure about mainstream media. I mean, the mainstream media, there's things are overlooked all the time in mainstream media. And we can do critiques. We can do critiques of media. I think what's more intellectually interesting, or what we would be more concerned with in an academic context, is the scholarly literature, and can we see gaps and absences in scholarly literature, and I think that's right. I think there could be more work done on women in independence movements. That's a good example. To what extent do you think American and Soviet encouragement for self-determination and decolonization was humanitarian and ideological, or do you think it was instead a strategic and political support to undermine existing powers? I think it was. I, I wouldn't put together, it wasn't I wouldn't put together humanitarian ideological. I would say it was strategic and political and ideological, um, uh, um, its efforts to expand their social systems, political systems, economic systems, and ideological systems into a world that was in upheaval and a world of declining European power. And this provided a context within which, these new superpowers with kind of universalizing ideologies and global ambitions could be in conflict with each other. So Leninism and Wilsonianism, these sort of eponymous ideologies, these isms, were global in scope, and they conflicted with each other in that context. I think I've got time for one more substantive question, and then there's lots of questions that will come at 5 after I leave. With the investment from China into lots of African countries, is there a worry the economic damage done by rapid decolonization could lead to further neocolonialism in some former colonies from Chinese influence? I mean, I think that's a good question. I think that the economic vulnerability experienced by many African societies because of the way decolonization did not was more juridical than political and economic, has meant that you know elite government officials in African societies can cut deals with any outside actor, including China, to extract economic resources that are not primarily then benefiting raw materials that are not primarily benefiting the local people. And so I think that's I think that's right. It's interesting that Western observers are more likely to talk about neocolonialism and in the context of China than looking at the legacy of empire and European imperialism. There's so many more questions. I wish that we had more time.
Just before you go,
Yes, yeah.
there is one that just says, "Do you have any books you would recommend reading on regarding this or a similar topic?" So if anyone wanted to go away and approach something similar, is there anything they could look at?
I did mention Nkrumah's pamphlet. I would also recommend the Erez Manella's book, The Wilsonian Moment, which is an account of how anti-colonial movements around the world responded to the ideas around self-determination that were circulating in Versailles. It's called the Wilsonian moment, but it's not really about Wilson. It's about this sort of historic, this sort of period in 1918 to 1919, when there was this uh, opening in the kind of discourse of international relations that lots of nationalist movements around the world, in Egypt, Korea, China, there's a couple of other cases that I can't think of at the top of my head, where there are detailed case studies of the sort of nationalist leaders and their perspectives, and then how that was the shutdown and led to disillusionment when it became very clear that this wasn't actually going to lead to decolonization, that it was a sort of more of a response to Leninist socialist threats than it was about really leading to a kind of to self-determination. So that's a really interesting moment, and it's a kind of quite influential book that's quite accessible as well. So I hope that you find that useful.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we can't get to all of these really specific questions, but
Yeah.
obviously Celine and I will both stay on this call. I do believe Celine is here, but if you do have any further specific questions, have a look at the things that Patricia's mentioned. But for now, I'll just say thank you so much, Patricia, for such
Thanks
a
so
great,
much.
interesting
Thanks
talk.
everyone. Thanks for the questions. Thanks, Avi. Bye.
Thank you. So obviously, Patricia has had to leave at 5, but we are still here. Celine, if you are here, would you be able to unmute and just introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi. My name is Celine, and I'm a first year studying PPE, and I come from Australia.
Perfect. And so if anyone has any, I do think there are a few questions in the chat that we can come to, but if anyone has some specific questions about applying for PPE or any sort of related degree at Oxford, and what it's like to study here, we'll be able to answer both of those. So if I go back up, unless anything's coming in. Okay, so I think there was a question early on that asked, so we both applied for PPE, for which there isn't, I believe, any submitted work that you need to put in as part of your application. But the question that said, when submitting written work for history and politics, is one subject preferable to the other to submit, or should you submit work for both? Also, is it better to submit essays or source questions? All of the information about what best to submit, I think, would be best directed to the admissions office. So you can find the admissions office for the college that you end up applying to, and they'll be able to advise you on if there's any specific requirements or anything like that. In terms of is it preferable to submit one subject preferable to the other, I can't imagine that. Or should you submit work for both? Okay, so I'm going to say that I don't actually know the specifics about submitted work for history and politics as I should do, because we don't do history and politics at Somerville. But if you wanted to ask more questions, please do either send that along to me on the access email, and I can try and find a better response for you. But otherwise, the department website or the actual university website with the course page will be should be your best bet to give you advice on what to do in that situation. But obviously, if you are in year 12 at the moment, I would say submitted work is something that you only have to worry about a little bit later down the line. So you have time to sort that out. So I wouldn't worry too much at this stage. I think there was another question that was a bit more, less about decolonization, which is not our specialties. But so for my PP personal statement, which of the three would you recommend I focus on in terms of my supercurricular reading, work, competitions, etc.? So I believe that's which of the three is in reference to which of the three subjects. And if that's the case, then the very, very strict answer is all of them. You should really be covering all three subjects in your personal statement. And obviously that will depend on if you're applying for PPE, all of your choices on your UCAS form, so you get up to 5 choices. And if you are applying for all 5 for PPE, that obviously makes it easier. But I know that as a joint honours degree, it is something that you tend to perhaps apply for slightly different degrees at different places. So you will have to weigh up which options are more important and how you balance that subject discussion. But it is important to sort of showcase that you're interested, you have sort of some sort of enthusiasm for all three of the subjects. Especially when you're applying, I think, to the PPE course at Oxford, because they do like to see that you are at least engaged enough to study at all three for the first year. And as I mentioned earlier in the call, you do, at the end of the first year at Oxford, get the opportunity to drop one of the subjects if you'd wish. You can obviously continue with three, as Patricia said. And so that's a choice that you make later, but you do need to have enough interest to be able to do it for 1 year. And so when you are talking about supercurricular, or maybe the three things you were talking about was in terms of supercurricular reading, work, and competitions. If that's the case, I'm sorry I've talked a lot about subjects, but in terms of balancing those things, I think um, supercurricular reading is probably the most important thing you can talk about, especially with a degree like PPE where you're not expected to have studied at any of the subjects before. Being able to show where you've engaged with a subject outside of your schoolwork, how you've done it, why you've done it, that's the most important thing. And really showing them that you've engaged and that you have had your own thoughts about these things, having spoken about doing the thing, making sure you're showing them that you've actually engaged with the material that you were reading, and that you can do that by having opinions about it, by discussing whether you think it's right, whether it's wrong, discussing whether you think someone's opinion is perhaps more right than another's, things like that. And I think competitions, engaging with competitions, is just another way to show that you have uh, pursued the subject outside of school, and it doesn't matter if you win or not. If you do enter an essay competition, it's a really good way to show that you've invested in the subject area. And I think, I don't know what you mean in terms of work there, but perhaps maybe in terms of schoolwork, obviously, if it relates to the thing you're talking about, it relates to politics, econ, philosophy, that's great. But they do want to see your work outside of the school curriculum. So do focus on things that you're doing outside, because that's going to show them sort of most obviously how interested you are. Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer. So if you wanted anything confirmed or made clearer, please do say something in the chat again. Um, so, uh, I'm going to come to you, Celine. So I realized that I've answered quite a few of these questions. So we had a question here that said, I think it was a little bit more towards Patricia, who'd be able to perhaps give more of an admissions focused answer, but I think we'll still be able to help. So the question is, concerning the quite unique competition for PP at Oxford, would you have any recommendations to navigate through that? Would you have any recommendations for someone who potentially doesn't have access to as many resources as other people who will be applying to PP at Oxford? I'm just thinking in terms of your application process, coming from obviously Australia, how did you find applying, and what resources did you use when you were making your application?
I think coming from Australia, like no one in or there's one other girl in my cohort who applied. So I came in like not knowing what to do at all. And I think it was not ideal, but it was fine. There are plenty of resources online, either through the Oxford website or like other external sources, with either like interview prep questions and preparing for TSA and what to put in your personal statement. So there are lots of resources out there. But I think for my personal statement, what really helped me know, oh, PP is what I want to study, is I was able to write something quite quickly. The editing took absolutely forever, but I think if you can't come up with stuff about why PPE interests you, then maybe PPE isn't quite for you. But in my personal statement, I wrote about um, I think I did a few MUN or like competitions, books I read, and like you want to treat. Oh, I think they now have like questions given, right, instead of a big essay. But I'm not sure what the questions are like, but like it can't be a checklist. You're not writing every single thing that you've done. You've got to talk a bit more about the book that you've read and why you found it insightful, and your take on the book. So they want to see you engaging with additional material. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. I've just seen that there's been a sort of extension to that question that I'll try and address. So I I think Ali said the first question of the new UCAS personal statement is why would you like to study this course? How much should I write for this section? So short answer is I believe that the minimum answer for each of the 3 sections, although don't quote me on this, do check with your school and whoever's helping you write this, is 350 words. And so my short answer is at least 350 words. But kind of aside from that, as much as you want. It's really difficult, I think, for me to tell you what you should write because it's kind of called a personal statement for a reason. It's really up to you how you want to balance the sections and how much you want to write for each one, how much weight you want to give to each one. Having said what I said earlier, obviously supercurriculars. I think there is one question that sort of lends you towards writing a bit more about supercurriculars, but I would mention supercurriculars even in this question. Why would you like to study the course? Well, you can easily talk about the things that you've engaged with. What fascinates you about politics, philosophy, economics individually? What different ideas or topics or points of debate have you come across that have made you want to understand more or learn more? And then that could easily lead you into things that you've read in order to answer those questions or things that you've done in order to find out more. And so I think, it really is what you make it. And so do really think about those individual questions and how you're best going to answer them. But remember that each question is still an opportunity to showcase, just how are you interested in the subject? How have you engaged with that? That's kind of the sort of the foundation of everything. There were some more specific questions. So, um, okay, one before about applications. What would make up a strong PP application? I think a strong PPE application, sorry, um, really, I think, targets your interests in each of those subjects. And so for me personally, when I was applying, I looked at each, obviously because it was a personal statement that didn't have any specific questions, so I split mine up into 3 different subjects. And I looked at each subject in turn, and all I did was pick one kind of idea or topic in each of those subjects that I was interested in, that I'd come up with myself, that I hadn't sort of no one had told me to look at this area. I think for politics I had done history GCSE, and we did an in-depth study of China in as part of the GCSE, and I really enjoyed that topic. And sort of as an aside, when I was doing that, had read an autobiography by, it's called Wild Swans. You probably heard of it, or you might have heard of it, sorry. And it's an autobiography from the perspective of one woman and her mother and grandmother who all lived within China at different stages in its like political um, narrative journey. And I found it was an autobiography, so it's not an academic piece of work, but I found it so interesting that I talked about it when I was writing my personal statement, because I had done that reading and I had thought about things about communist China and had all these like ideas, and it led me towards I read the Communist Manifesto. I'll tell you now, I don't think I understood it. When I was 17, I don't think I really knew what I was reading, but I did try and read it. And I did show that in my personal statement. I did talk about something that an idea I'd seen in it and tried to understand and didn't really understand. And I think looking back on that, the idea that I actually spoke about, I think the way that I spoke about it really was quite obvious that I didn't know what I was talking about, but that didn't really matter. It kind of only mattered, I think, I can only guess, I'm not an admissions tutor, but I think it only mattered that I had shown that I had genuinely put the work in and found something that I was interested in, pursued it, and tried to understand it. I think that's what they're really looking for, because you're not supposed to have you're not expected to have studied any of these subjects before. And so just showing that you have an interest that's genuine and it is genuine to you is you can't go wrong with that. And so really just looking at each individual subject and picking something that draws particularly like jumps out at you is kind of my best advice. I would say, sorry, I'm answering this question quite long, but I think with philosophy is something that people often struggle with, is because if you haven't had much exposure to philosophy, not sure where to start, then in which case I would look up introductory reading lists. There are lots of them online. Different universities put them out. I think LSE had one out when I was applying. And they have a few introductory texts that you can look at that will go through kind of basic philosophy concepts, basic ideas in the subject. And I would use those as a jumping off point to find the thing that you want to write about. I would try not to write about those introductory texts, try not to write about the actual that text itself and what that person said, because a lot of people will be reading those, and you want to really stand out. You want to show that you've got an interest and that's unique. And so use those texts to expose yourself to the subject, and then find something that's they talk about, and see if you can find that primary text or something closer to the original idea that they're talking about, and read that at its source, and then discuss what you think about that. That's sort of my best advice there. Um, so there was another question about Celine, would you be able to answer for PPE, are we expected when we apply to be equally, oh no, well, yeah, are we expected to be equally competent in economics, philosophy, politics, or is it okay to be stronger in one or two areas and weaker in the others?
Yeah. I think because you might not apply for PP for all five of your options. So maybe like, because not all universities offer it. So sometimes your application might be a little bit more heavy in like economics and politics instead of all three. But you do kind of have to show that you are a strong student in all three discipline, because in the first year, that's what you're studying, like the degrees PPE. And it wouldn't be a good idea if you only wrote about two of the three.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, sorry. Exactly. I think it's okay to be stronger in two, and not three, because the tutors do know that you're probably going to, well, not probably, but a lot of people do choose to drop one subject to the end of the first year, and that's not something that's new to them. They know that people will probably be stronger in two, rather than all three. But yeah, as Celine said, really important to just show that you've got an interest in it, at least to do 1 year's worth of study of it. I think there was also a question here about, do you have to choose two in the second or third year? Would it be too much for doing all three? Are there opportunities to study abroad within the course? So I kind of answered that. You can do all three. It's not too much. I think the difference is that if you do all three subjects, so you'll need to do core modules in all three of those subjects for your finals, the final exams you take at the end of your third year here. And if you do sort of core modules in three subjects, every PPS takes eight exams at the end of their degree. They'll do eight assessed things. And obviously, if you're using core, some of your eight will be cores in politics, philosophy, and economics. You just have less opportunities to do optional modules, and these are things that you get to pick that are like more what's the word? Um, influenced by your own personal interests and things. And so basically the difference between doing all three versus doing two is that you get a difference of breadth versus depth. And so I chose to do two subjects. I did politics and philosophy, because I was really interested in political philosophy, the intersection of both. And so by doing those two subjects, I was able to basically pick almost all eight papers that were in that intersection that were very specific to my interests. I think the few that perhaps were a little bit different were either core papers that I had to take that I chose out of the core modules that were on offer, or something a little bit different that I was interested in. So one of the politics papers I took was the politics of South Asia, which was a bit more practical philosophy, looking at actual events and things, and analysing political events, whereas political philosophy is a bit more theory based and looking at ideology and different thinkers and things like that. So that's sort of the way up. And then other opportunities to study abroad within the course. The short answer is no. At Oxford, there aren't. PPE doesn't have any sort of abroad, no schemes to like actually go abroad as part of the course. However, that is not to say that you can't, whilst you're here, go abroad. There are travel grants available at Somerville. We have quite a generous travel grant scheme that works. So students can apply to get money to go abroad, and cover some of their costs, often most of their costs. And it doesn't have to be that related to your degree, kind of just tangentially related is okay. And they're sort of like quite that kind of opportunity is quite prevalent within Oxford. I think there's a lot of opportunities for you to broaden your horizons just outside of outside term time, and so you can do things like that. But if you wanted to actually study abroad as part of your course, I would look at other courses at other universities, because I think there are PPE is, I think from memory, I remember York had an element that allowed you to go abroad and study as part of their PPE course. So I would have a look at other universities if that's something you were looking for. Um, Other things. Okay. Celine, sorry, I realize I am talking a lot about these questions, but could you perhaps speak about whether they value the amount of reading you do, or would they still be interested in your application as long as you have access, if you have access knowledge in the field with videos, podcasts, TED Talks, etc. So kind of thinking about, how best to find supercurriculars. Is it easy to find books and things like that?
Yeah, so I had quite a mix. I think I had two books, but I also put in podcasts. So I listened to The Economist quite a bit and I put that in. Um, so I don't think it hurts putting like a diverse range of stuff that you've done. Um, because I like I'm not the person doing the admin, so I don't know exactly like how they weigh up certain stuff. But I think any interest in the three fields is sufficient, and anything that shows that you engage with the subjects outside of school is good.
Yeah, I agree. Just anything that exactly as Celine said, if you can talk about it in a way that's meaningful and shows your engagement, then it's worth putting in. But just remember that you have limited number of characters, so make sure you're spending as many characters as possible talking about the actual thing you took away from it, rather than talking about the thing you did, because it's less impressive to say, I did this, I attended this lecture by this person. If you have all of those words in your personal statement, then you probably need to talk a little bit more about what you took away from the lecture and perhaps cut down. And so sometimes I think I was really scrimping for words, so I would just reference the person's last name and say so and so, so the lecture by so and so, or like make it possessive, so there was as few characters as possible attributed to the thing itself, and more characters attributed to what I took away from it, what I thought about it, etc. There was a question here, which pathways from your degree are you going to take and why? I think pathways is, I don't know if that's like future careers after your degree or like within your degree. I personally came into the degree really interested in politics. That was the one I had been kind of looking at doing at university when I first thought about going to university. But I after having like came into the degree thinking about potentially going to political journalism, or writing, I think is what I was interested in. But I would say a PPE degree really opens so many doors for you because it's so versatile. It's such a broad range of skills and such a broad like range of topics that you can really do anything with it. I think the thing that I usually say is you can do anything with a PPE degree apart from become a doctor, because there's a very specific set of skills. But even having done a PPE degree, you could always do a graduate entry course in medicine and become a doctor. So there's really no doors closed by doing a PPE degree. I think that's one of the really good things about it. And it really attracted itself to me because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 17 years old. Okay. For economics, I've been reading a lot of mathematically intense works in fundamental economic theory. Would you say this is more or less useful than just reading basic economic theory or current affairs? I can't say either way. It depends how much you understand of the intense works and fundamental stuff that you've been engaging with, and what you're taking away from it. Is it engaging? Because I would say that reading anything is really really interesting, and you can have a really interesting thought about a really basic concept. Don't feel like you have to engage with the most confusing and complicated parts of these subjects. I think everything I touched in my personal statement was really stuff that I started studying in the first year of my degree. It's quite entry level basic topics, but I was just starting to think about them, and they know that you're going to be really introductory to these ideas, and so they're not expecting you to deal with really hard, difficult things. They're just looking to see that you're dealing with anything at all in these subjects. Um, would you add anything to that, Celine?
Yeah, I think it's better to like understand current affairs and basic stuff. Like that's more worthwhile than reciting hard equations or reciting difficult quotes. So it's better if you can understand and talk about something maybe a bit more basic confidently than being able to just recite difficult economics.
Yeah. Agree. So the sort of follow-up question was, one of my backup courses I'm applying to is philosophy and economics. Would it harm my application to focus more heavily on those two subjects if I still mention politics briefly? I think, as I think we've said prior to this, covering all three subjects is important. The weight you give to each is, I think you can get away with kind of focusing on two more heavily and just mentioning one more briefly. And the thing I would just draw attention to is the fact that these subjects are so interlinked, and so you can talk about philosophy and politics at the same time by talking about political philosophy. And then you've covered both of those subjects without having to talk about three different topics. And so you can find the intersections of those subjects and find those and talk about those in order to make your life a bit easier when you're structuring what to talk about. And if you're not sure, if you don't have your topics picked out, you don't have a clear idea of what you're interested in, I would definitely suggest looking at the intersections between the topics, between each of these subjects, and thinking about whether that's something that you might want to look into, because it would definitely help, I think, if you're trying to weigh up what you're talking about, depending on where you're applying. I don't know, Celine, did you apply to PPE for all 5 of your options?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I think it was like the easiest way for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I applied to PPE for 4 out of 5 of mine. The fifth one I applied to was politics and economics, rather than PPE. But I will say that I didn't really consider that when I was applying to that course. I kind of just let them read the philosophy that was in there. And I will say the philosophy that I did include was political philosophy. And so I kind of just didn't really think, assumed that it would still be relevant to them, regardless of the fact that they don't do a philosophy course in the course I was applying for. But yeah, that's my sort of advice for that. Um, what advice would you give to someone who is stuck between a mathematics related degree or a BP degree, despite doing a few supercurriculars to help decide? I'm still a bit stuck. Interesting. Okay, so a mathematics related degree, I guess, would be um it's very it's interesting because I guess if a mathematics related degree, I don't know if you mean like a maths degree, like a STEM degree, or something like E&M, like economics and management, if that's what you mean, or whether it would be two um STEM versus humanities. And I think if it's the latter, you've got it's quite a good pros and cons thing to weigh up, because STEM degrees are structured quite differently to humanities degrees. There's a lot more focus on sort of lectures in the way of learning, I would say, and whereas in humanities there's a lot more independent study. So you're going to have to do a lot more reading if you're doing a PPE degree. I will say PPE is known as a reader's degree, so if you don't enjoy reading, be warned, there's a lot of reading that you've got to do. I don't know if you agree. But they yeah, with a maths degree, you're probably going to be doing more lectures, you're going to be taught more things and concepts, and the kind of work you'll be producing will be problems, solving problem sheets, doing problems, and so that kind of, if that work appeals to you, then that's something. With PPE, you are going to have to write essays. So if you don't like writing essays, that might be an easy decision. And I will say with a PPE degree, you can make a PPE degree very mathsy. So the other thing I should probably say is, everyone who does PP at Oxford will do the same thing in first year. There's an introductory course that's Introduction to Politics, Introduction to Philosophy, Introduction to Economics, and everyone will sit exams in all 3 of those papers at the end of their first year. And they don't count towards your end degree. You just need to pass all 3 papers in order to proceed to the second year. And then once you start the second year, the thing that I like to say is that you can sit next to a PPist in your second year and be doing completely different degrees, because the amount of choice that you can get in structuring your degree means that one PPS will never do really the same thing as another. And I was doing a very political philosophy degree, which had a lot of essays and a lot of reading, whereas I had friends who were doing very, very economics heavy degrees and doing a lot more maths and a lot more problem solving, and a lot less essay writing. And so you can really choose what you want to focus on and how you want to structure your degree. And if you like maths, you can make maths a big part of what you're doing here. Um, just so you know, the way that the degree works is when you get to second year, you need to pick 8 different papers that you'll take, and you have to split if you're doing a what's called a bipartite, tripartite, bipartite. I can't remember how you say that word, but basically, if you're taking 2 of the subjects, you need to take 5 subjects the maximum you can take in one area, one subject, is 5 papers. So you have to take a minimum of 3 papers in the other. But obviously you can split that 5-3 or 4-4, whatever you prefer, or the other way. So then 3-5 the other way. I chose to do 5-3, and I did 5 in politics, 3 in philosophy. But one of the philosophy papers I took was actually kind of a politics paper because it was feminist theory, so it was like political philosophy. So I kind of did 6-2. So I beat the system a little bit. But I will say, in that vein, if you wanted to, you could take a lot of maths heavy papers in economics. And so you'd be doing really kind of like maths adjacent things like I'm thinking now like econometrics is a thing I can think of. Um, Again, don't ask me any specific questions about these econ papers because I did not take them. I do not have a great aptitude for insane maths that you do in those papers, but anything, any kind of like quantitative, like politics papers as well, like where you're doing like data analysis and you're looking at data sets and like understanding them, putting them through. If you've heard of R Studio is something that we use whilst we're students here, and it's a programming language system. I don't know which you can import like understand data sets through. It's basically you get taught it. We get classes in it through our politics course in first year. So don't worry if you don't understand anything I'm saying because I barely understood what I was doing when I was doing it. So you'll be fine. Once you get here, you'll get that explained to you. But basically, the short answer is you if that's something that if you're still interested in politics in this area, then I would definitely think about you know that you can make the degree what you want. So I'd say the best advice maybe is come up from an open day and look at both subjects, meet people in person who do them, and see if that helps make that decision for you. But it's an interesting conundrum to have. So yeah, best of luck with that. I hope that those were good answers to your questions. Okay, I realize we're at 5:30 now, but there's one more that's just come in. Would it hurt your personal statement to of link your discussion of all three of politics, philosophy, and economics to the same specific area of interest? No, absolutely not. I think if you could talk about the same thing from a philosophy, politics, and economics angle, that would be really, really interesting. So I mean, I'm not the gospel, so don't take me at my word, but I personally think that would be really, really interesting to do. And obviously, make sure that you've got a broad range of knowledge, but hopefully that would come out from looking at these things from different subject angles. So you want to be able to show that you know a lot of different things, but if you can analyze the same thing in three different from three different ways, I think that would make for a really interesting essay, regardless of what it was for, whether it was a personal statement or something else. So yeah, definitely. Okay. I think that takes us to the end of our time. If you have any other questions that you didn't get to ask, please do email us. I'm going to put something in the chat now. If you have an opportunity to give us some feedback for these sessions, that would be really helpful. Just helps us improve further things that we run. But otherwise, thank you so much to Celine for joining us and answering some questions, and thank you all for coming. Hope it was useful, and hope to see you at any kind of summer event soon. Otherwise, have a lovely evening. Thank you.